In the middle of a packed courtroom, my parents mocked me for being a failure and demanded the judge give them everything I owned. They thought I was defeated, that their victory was certain, but then I calmly placed a single, secret paper on the judge's desk. His eyes widened in shock, and he gave a chilling order that made my parents' blood run cold. Lock the doors now. Before we find out what was written on that single piece of paper, I would love to know where you're listening from on our planet. Let me know your city and country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Okay, let's get back to the courtroom. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal theater, and I had been cast as the villain in a play my parents had written and directed. For weeks, they had been on a public crusade, painting me as the incompetent, negligent daughter who had single-handedly run their beloved Harrison Philanthropic Foundation into the ground. They had established the foundation years ago, a shining beacon of their supposed generosity, and they had given me the important-sounding title of treasurer on the board. "It's just a title, Audrey," my mother, Eleanor, had said at the time. "It will look wonderful on your resume. It shows you're part of the family's legacy." I now understood that family legacy was a euphemism for scapegoat. When their years of reckless spending and shady dealings finally caught up with them, and the foundation collapsed under a mountain of debt, they needed someone to blame. And I was the perfect target. I was the quiet one. The one with the boring accounting job, the one who didn't fit in with their flashy, charismatic lifestyle. The lawsuit they filed against me was a work of fiction, a masterpiece of deflection. They claimed my gross mismanagement and financial negligence had led to the foundation's demise. They were suing me for the full amount of the foundation's debts, a sum that would not only bankrupt me, but would leave me in financial ruin for the rest of my life. Their goal was not just to save their own hidden assets, it was to publicly destroy me, to make me the official story of why their philanthropic empire had crumbled. And so, I sat in that cold courtroom listening as their lawyer, a man with the hungry eyes of a shark, painted a picture of me as a foolish, inept woman who had betrayed her family's trust. "This is a woman," he thundered, pointing a dramatic finger at me, "who was given the keys to a kingdom of charity, a chance to do good in this world. And what did she do with that trust? She squandered it. Through a combination of incompetence and breathtaking negligence, she allowed this noble institution, the life's work of my clients, Richard and Eleanor Harrison, to collapse into ruin." I looked over at my parents. They were playing their parts to perfection. My mother held a lace handkerchief to her eyes, dabbing at tears that were not there. My father stared at me, his face a mask of profound paternal disappointment. They were so convincing that even I, the person who knew the truth, felt a momentary flicker of self-doubt. The courtroom was filled with reporters and members of the city's elite, all people my parents had personally invited to witness my public execution. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgmental stares like a physical weight. They saw what they were meant to see, the guilty daughter, the family failure.
What they couldn't see was the quiet, cold fury burning in my chest. They couldn't see the hundreds of hours I had spent in the 2 weeks leading up to this hearing, not with lawyers, but alone in my small apartment with my laptop. They couldn't see the digital breadcrumbs I had followed, the encrypted files I had decrypted, the complex web of lies I had so carefully and meticulously unraveled. They saw a scapegoat. They had no idea they were looking at a forensic accountant who was about to present the audit of their lives. Their lawyer finally rested his case. The judge, a weary-looking man who had clearly presided over too many ugly family disputes, looked down at me from his bench. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice tired, "your parents have presented a compelling, if tragic, case. Given the evidence presented by their counsel and your own lack of a legal defense team, I am inclined to rule in their favor." My parents exchanged a small, triumphant smile. This was it, their final victory. However, the judge continued. In the interest of due process, I will ask you one last time. Do you have anything at all to say for yourself, or any evidence to present in your defense, before I make my ruling? The entire courtroom leaned forward. They were expecting tears, a desperate plea, a final pathetic denial. I took a deep breath, the first I felt I had taken all day. I stood up slowly, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked at the judge, my expression unreadable. Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick, expectant silence of the room. I do. I have one single piece of evidence I would like to submit. The judge's words hung in the air, heavy with a finality that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the courtroom. Do you have anything at all to say for yourself, Miss Miller? It was the last stop on the road to my own execution, a final, polite formality before my life was officially ruined. I looked at my parents, Richard and Eleanor. My mother gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent command to accept my fate gracefully. My father just looked down at his hands, the picture of a disappointed patriarch forced to disown his own foolish child. They thought this was the end. But as I rose to my feet, the cool, smooth paper of my single, final exhibit resting against my palm, my mind flashed back to the 2 weeks of silent, furious work that had led to this very moment. My sacrifice during that time was not one of action, but of endurance. It was the sacrifice of my reputation, my peace, my very name. The lawsuit my parents had filed was not a quiet, private affair. They had made it a public spectacle. They had leaked their version of the story to the local press, and the city's most voracious society columnist had feasted upon it. The headlines were a daily torment. Philanthropic power couple heartbroken by daughter's catastrophic mismanagement. Harrison Foundation collapse blamed on inexperienced treasurer. I couldn't go to the grocery store without feeling the weight of pitying, judgmental stares. Old family friends would cross the street to avoid me. My phone, which had once been a source of connection, fell silent, the silence broken only by the occasional abusive text message from one of my cousins telling me how ashamed they were. I was publicly branded a failure, an incompetent fool who had destroyed her own family's legacy of charity. And through it all, I remained silent. I didn't issue a rebuttal. I didn't defend myself. I let them build their narrative. I let them construct the pyre upon which they intended to burn me. My silence, they believed, was an admission of guilt. They had no idea it was the quiet, focused concentration of a hunter, patiently tracking her prey through a dense digital jungle.
My real life began after midnight. After the world was asleep, I would go to my small home office, the pain and humiliation of the day fueling a cold, precise, and methodical fury. They had called me a failure. They had mocked my boring career as an accountant. They were about to learn what a forensic accountant with a score to settle could really do. My investigation began in the digital ruins of the Harrison Philanthropic Foundation. I still had my board credentials, and I used them to access their servers from the inside. I started with the expense reports, the ledgers, the wire transfers. For the first few days, everything looked plausible, if a little sloppy. There were massive payments for consulting services, event management, marketing outreach. But the recipients were all shell corporations with vague, important-sounding names. Global Strategy Solutions, Apex Development Group, Viridian Logistics. I went deeper. Using the forensic tools of my trade, I began to peel back the layers of these ghost companies. I followed the digital breadcrumbs across the globe. I found incorporation documents in Panama, in the Cayman Islands, in Liechtenstein. These were classic, textbook shell corporations designed for one purpose: to make money disappear. They had no offices, no employees, no websites. They were just names on a screen, legal fictions designed to hide the truth. The real work? The work that took me a week of sleepless, caffeine-fueled nights was tracing where the money went after it entered the shells. It was a complex, deliberately tangled web of international wire transfers, a digital shell game designed to confound any auditor. A payment from the foundation would go to Panama, then be split and sent to 2 different accounts in Switzerland and Belize, then recombined and funneled through a holding company in Hong Kong. It was a masterful, criminal enterprise, and my parents were at the center of it. For a week, I felt like I was losing my mind, chasing shadows through the dark corners of the financial world. And then I found it. The key. The single fatal mistake they had made. It was a transaction from one of the Cayman Islands shell corporations, a massive transfer of just over $1 million. But this transfer didn't go to another anonymous shell. It went to a private wealth management account based in Zurich, and I, through a deep dive analysis of cross-referenced transaction numbers that my father had carelessly, arrogantly signed off on, was able to get the name on that final account. It was not Global Strategy Solutions. It was not a numbered account. The beneficiary name was simple, elegant, and utterly damning. The Richard and Eleanor Miller Family Holdings, LLC. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable link, the single, undeniable proof that the money being spent by the charity was being funneled directly into my own parents' secret offshore slush fund. I remember the moment I found it. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky outside my window in shades of gray and pink. I just stared at the screen, at the clean, digital line that ran from a children's charity directly to my parents' hidden fortune. The sense of vindication I expected to feel wasn't there. There was no joy, no triumphant fist pump. There was only a profound, soul-crushing sadness. Any lingering, foolish hope I had held that this was all just a terrible mistake, a case of incompetence and not malice, was gone forever. They hadn't just thrown me under the bus to save themselves from a business failure. They had sacrificed their own daughter to protect the profits of a massive, long-running criminal enterprise.
It was in that moment that my resolve became absolute. My quiet investigation was over. My silent sacrifice was complete. I printed a single page, the wire transfer confirmation showing the transaction from the Shell Corp to their private holdings. I folded it neatly and placed it in my briefcase. I was no longer just fighting for my own reputation. I was fighting for every donor they had ever deceived, for every good cause that money should have gone to. I was fighting for the truth. And now, as I stood in that cold courtroom, I was ready to present my final exhibit. They had called me a failure, but my greatest skill has always been finding the truth, no matter how well it is hidden. And their biggest failure was forgetting that. I stood in the cold, silent courtroom, the judge's question hanging in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Do you have anything at all to say for yourself, Ms. Miller?" I saw my parents exchange a look across the plaintiff's table, a look of smug, confident pity. I saw their lawyer, a shark in a $1,000 suit, give a small, dismissive shake of his head, certain that the trial was over, that his victory was assured. They were all expecting me to cry, to stammer out a pathetic, emotional plea for mercy. They were expecting the failure daughter to perform her final, definitive failure. My mind, however, was a sea of calm. The weeks of public humiliation, the sleepless nights spent hunting through digital archives, the profound, soul-crushing grief of my parents' betrayal, it had all been compressed into this single, crystalline moment of absolute clarity. My father's plan, his final act of love and protection, had led me here. "Trust the plan, Lily," his voice echoed in my memory. My apologies. I seem to have mixed up my protagonists. Let's correct that. My own quiet strength, a trait my family had always mistaken for weakness, was my guide. I was not a victim about to be sentenced. I was an auditor about to present my findings. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick, expectant silence of the room. "I have one single piece of evidence I would like to submit." A murmur went through the small gallery. I saw my mother, Eleanor,
roll her eyes in annoyance. My father, Richard, whispered something to their lawyer, who immediately shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he boomed, his voice full of theatrical outrage. "This is a highly irregular display. Any and all evidence should have been submitted through the proper channels of discovery weeks ago. The defense has submitted nothing. This is a desperate last-minute tactic intended to derail these proceedings and waste the court's time." The judge looked down at him from his bench, his expression of weary impatience. He had clearly had enough of this lawyer's blustering performances. "Your objection is noted, counsel," the judge said, his voice flat. "And I am growing tired of your theatrics. I will see the evidence." He waved a dismissive hand. "Sit down." The lawyer, his face flushing with anger, sat down abruptly. A small, silent victory. I picked up my briefcase from the floor beside my chair. I did not pull out a thick, intimidating dossier. I opened it and retrieved a single, solitary sheet of paper, folded neatly in thirds. I stood up, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as I began the long, lonely walk from my table to the judge's bench. With every step, I could feel their eyes on me, the pitying stares of the reporters, the confused looks of the creditors, and the hot, hateful glares of my own parents. I did not look at them. I focused on the judge's bench, the great wooden edifice that represented the truth I was about to reveal. As I walked, my mind was a quiet slideshow of my parents' lies. My mother's new diamond earrings she claimed were a lucky find. My father's new boat, the one he said a grateful client had gifted him. Their extravagant vacations, their performative philanthropy. All of it funded by a river of stolen money. A river whose source I had finally, painstakingly discovered. I reached the bench. A stern-looking bailiff took a step forward to intercept me, but the judge held up a hand, stopping him. "Let her approach," he said. I unfolded the single sheet of paper and placed it gently on the elevated desk before him, turning it so he could read it. It was not a letter. It was not a plea. It was a simple, boring, black and white printout of a wired transfer confirmation. My voice was quiet, but in the silent courtroom, it was perfectly clear. "Your Honor," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "For the past 2 hours, my parents' counsel has detailed the foundation's financial collapse, attributing it to my incompetence as treasurer." I pointed a single, steady finger at the paper before him. "This document is a wired transfer confirmation from one of the Foundation's primary consulting shell corporations, a corporation based in the Cayman Islands that received over $2 million in charitable funds over the last year." I let that sink in. The judge picked up the paper and put on his reading glasses. "I draw Your Honor's attention," I continued, "to the final beneficiary account name at the bottom of the page, the destination where that charitable money ultimately came to rest." The judge's experienced eyes scanned the page. I saw them move from the top, down past the routing numbers and transaction codes, to the very last line. I watched his face. The expression of weary boredom that had been there all morning vanished in an instant. His eyes widened slightly behind his glasses. His posture, which had been slumped, straightened with a sudden, sharp alertness. He read the line again, his lips moving silently. I knew the name he was reading. The Richard and Eleanor Miller Family Holdings, LLC. He looked up from the paper, his gaze no longer on me, but on the two people sitting at the plaintiff's table. He looked over the top of his glasses directly at my parents. The look on his face was no longer just alarmed. It had transformed into one of cold, dawning, and absolute fury. He, a judge in a court of law, finally understood. He had been lied to. His courtroom had been used as a stage for a criminal cover-up. My parents, seeing the look on the judge's face, began to squirm in their seats, their confident smirks melting into looks of nervous confusion. They had no idea what he was looking at, but they knew, with a sudden sickening certainty, that the game was over. The judge slowly lowered the paper, his knuckles white as he gripped its edges. He looked past my parents to the bailiff standing sentry by the heavy courtroom doors. His mouth opened, not to deliver his ruling, but to give a quiet, chilling order that would detonate my family's world and end their reign of deception forever.
I stood before the judge's bench, my hand resting on the single sheet of paper I had placed there. The air in the courtroom was thick with a new kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of boredom or pity. It was the tense, electric silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for a verdict it did not yet understand. My parents were whispering frantically to their lawyer, their faces a mixture of annoyance and confusion. They thought this was just another one of my pathetic, dramatic gestures, a final, foolish plea for sympathy. The judge, a man whose face I had come to know as a mask of weary indifference, was now a study in transformation. He picked up the paper, his movements slow and deliberate. He put on his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the document with the practiced efficiency of a man who has read thousands of such pages. I watched his eyebrows. They were the first to betray his reaction. They furrowed slightly in confusion, then shut up in sharp, sudden surprise. He read the page once. Then he took his glasses off, polished them with a handkerchief, put them back on, and read it again, this time much more slowly, his lips moving silently over the words. I knew the line he was reading, the line that was changing everything. Beneficiary account. The Richard and Eleanor Miller Family Holdings, LLC. He looked up, and the weariness was gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by a sharp, intelligent, and dangerous light. He looked over the top of his glasses, his gaze sweeping past the lawyers, past me, and landing with the force of a physical blow on my parents. The look on his face was no longer one of a civil court judge presiding over a bankruptcy hearing. It was the look of a man who had just been handed evidence of a far greater crime and who had been lied to in his own sacred chamber of law. "Counsel," the judge said to my parents' lawyer, his voice dangerously quiet, "you might want to advise your clients to remain silent." "Your Honor," the lawyer sputtered, confused. "On what grounds?" The judge ignored him. He looked to the bailiff, a large, stoic man standing by the main courtroom doors. "Officer," the judge said, his voice now low but carrying an unmistakable tone of absolute command, "no one leaves this courtroom. Immediately lock the doors. No one is to enter and no one is to leave until I give the order. Is that understood?" The bailiff, his eyes wide with surprise, but his training absolute, immediately moved to the doors, the heavy thud of the locks echoing in the now dead-silent room like a series of gunshots. My mother let out a small gasp. My father shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. What is the meaning of this? You can't hold us here." The judge's gaze, cold and furious, snapped back to my father. "Sit down, Mr. Harrison," he ordered, his voice like ice. "You lost the right to make demands in this courtroom the moment you decided to use it as a stage for your criminal enterprise." He held up the single sheet of paper. "For the past 2 hours, I have listened to you and your counsel systematically destroy your own daughter's reputation. You have painted her as an incompetent fool, a failure responsible for the collapse of your noble foundation." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "This document, however, tells a very different story. It tells a story not of incompetence, but of a sophisticated, long-running criminal conspiracy. It tells a story of charity fraud, of federal wire fraud, and of international money laundering on a massive scale." I shook my head, a look of pure disgust on his face. "It tells me, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, that you are not the victims here. You are predators of the highest order, and you had the audacity to try and use my courtroom as a shield for your crimes with your own daughter as the sacrificial lamb." As the weight of the judge's words settled over them, my parents seemed to shrink.
Their faces, which had been flushed with anger and confusion, were now ashen with a new, dawning terror. And then, the main courtroom doors, the ones that had just been locked, were thrown open with a force that made everyone jump. It was not the bailiff. It was 4 men and 2 women in dark professional suits. They moved with a quiet, efficient, and utterly intimidating purpose. The lead agent, a man with a grim, determined face, held up a badge to the bailiff. "FBI," he said calmly, "we're here for them." The agents flowed into the room, their movements a well-rehearsed dance. They walked directly to the plaintiff's table, ignoring the sputtering objections of the lawyer. 2 of them flanked my father, 2 flanked my mother. "Richard Harrison," the lead agent said, his voice calm and official, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Another agent turned to my mother. "Eleanor Harrison, you are also under arrest. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The sound of the metallic click of the handcuffs snapping onto my mother's wrist was the loudest thing I had ever heard. She let out a small, pathetic whimper, her face crumbling into a mask of pure, abject defeat. My father just stared at me, his eyes filled with a look of such profound, bottomless betrayal, it almost made me feel pity. Almost. The flashbulbs from the reporters in the gallery began to pop. A frantic, dazzling strobe light capturing the spectacular, newsworthy downfall of the city's most beloved philanthropists. They were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, past the reporters, past the stunned creditors, past me. As my mother was escorted past my table, she looked at me, her eyes pleading, searching for some sign of the daughter she thought she knew. I met her gaze, my own expression a calm, unreadable mask. I did not smile, I did not frown, I simply watched. I had walked into this courtroom a failure, a scapegoat, a defendant. I was now watching my accusers being led away in chains. The judge caught my eye from his bench. He gave me a single, slow nod of profound respect. The game was over. My father's plan was to see me ruined. My plan, it turned out, was just better. The courtroom erupted into a maelstrom of chaos. The reporters in the gallery, who had been lazily documenting a dry bankruptcy proceeding, were now a frenzy of activity, their cameras flashing like a violent lightning storm. The judge was banging his gavel, his calls for order completely lost in the cacophony. The creditors, who had come expecting to pick over my meager assets, were now staring, wide-eyed, at a far greater and more satisfying spectacle of justice. And my parents, my proud, untouchable parents, were being read their Miranda rights, their faces pale and slack with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen the very air from their lungs. I stood at my table, a lone, quiet island in the middle of the hurricane. The lead FBI agent, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, approached me as my parents were being led away. She nodded at me with a look of professional respect. "Ms. Miller," she said, her voice calm and clear amidst the noise, "thank you for your cooperation. We've been building a case against your parents' offshore activities for months, but the evidence you provided was the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. You did the right thing." Her words were a quiet validation, a confirmation from the world of law and order that my painful personal betrayal had served a greater purpose. I just nodded, unable to speak, and watched as my mother, on her way out of the courtroom, turned and gave me one last look. It was not a look of remorse or sadness. It was a look of pure, bottomless hatred. The look of a predator who had been outsmarted, of a queen who had been toppled from her throne by the one pawn she had never bothered to watch. The weeks that followed were a trial by media fire. Our family name, once a symbol of philanthropic grace in the city, was now synonymous with greed and criminal deception. The headlines were relentless. Philanthropic power couple arrested in massive charity fraud scheme. Daughter's courtroom bombshell exposes parents' criminal empire.
I was hounded by reporters, by television producers, all wanting the exclusive story of the daughter who had sent her own parents to prison. I refused all of them. I issued a single, short written statement through a lawyer I had hired, stating only that I had fulfilled my legal and ethical duty to report a crime, and that my sole focus was on seeking justice for the donors and beneficiaries who had been defrauded. My parents, faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence I had compiled, had no choice but to accept a plea bargain. They were sentenced to 7 years in a federal prison for wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Their assets, both domestic and the hidden offshore accounts my investigation had uncovered, were seized by the government. They lost everything: their house, their cars, their social standing, their freedom. Their entire, beautifully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies, had been demolished by a single sheet of paper. My own legal battles were much simpler. The civil suit against me was immediately dismissed with prejudice. The bankruptcy court, in light of the criminal investigation, issued a public and formal apology for the duress I had been put under. My name was cleared, but I felt no sense of triumph. There is no real victory in watching your own family destroy itself. There was only a vast, empty, and quiet sense of sorrow. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I would go back to my quiet life, to my boring accounting job, and try to piece together a future from the wreckage of my past. But about 6 months later, I received another unexpected phone call. It was from the state attorney general's office. The government, having recovered the millions of dollars my parents had funneled from the foundation, was in the process of restructuring it under new, state-appointed leadership, and they wanted me to be on the new board of directors. Ms. Miller, the deputy AG, had said, "No one on this planet knows the finances of that foundation better than you do, and no one has a greater moral claim to ensuring it is run correctly. We need your expertise. We need your integrity." And so my new life began. I accepted the position. My first act on the new board of the Harrison Community Trust, as we renamed it, was to conduct a full, transparent public audit of every remaining dollar. My second act was to personally oversee the distribution of those recovered funds. The money did not go to lavish galas or self-aggrandizing building projects. It went to the small, underfunded grassroots charities my parents' foundation was supposed to have supported all along. The local homeless shelter, the inner-city after-school program, the free health clinic. I was not just a bookkeeper anymore. I was actively rebuilding what they had broken. I was restoring honor to a name they had so thoroughly disgraced.
It's been 2 years now. My parents are still in prison. I do not visit them. I do not know if I will ever be able to forgive them, but I have, at last, found a way to move forward. This evening, I stood on a stage, cutting a ribbon at the grand opening of a new wing for the city's pediatric hospital, a wing funded entirely by the newly revitalized trust. As I looked out at the sea of grateful faces, I thought about the long, strange journey that had brought me here. My vindication wasn't the moment I saw my parents in handcuffs. It wasn't the public exoneration or the quiet respect I now received. It was this, the quiet, constructive work of making things right. My parents' greatest crime was not the money they stole, but their willingness to sacrifice me, their own child, to protect their lies. My greatest victory was not in their punishment, but in using my own boring skills to build something real and good from the ashes of their deceit. They had called me a failure, but in the end, I had become the very thing they had only ever pretended to be, a person of substance, dedicated to a purpose larger than myself. And that was a fortune they could never have understood, and one they could never take away. An absolutely incredible story of betrayal, justice, and ultimately redemption through rebuilding. What do you think of Audrey's final act of leading the new foundation? Let us know your thoughts on this powerful story in the comments below. If you are inspired by this tale of a daughter's quiet strength, please show your support by hitting that like button, and be sure to subscribe for more daily stories of karma and satisfying vindication. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.